Hello and welcome back to another video. So today I'm going to be building a PC in Fractal Design's latest case, the Meshify 2 Compact. And this is going to be another full step-by-step PC build guide. We're going to be showing you how to put together all the parts I've got in front of me and come up with a fully working PC by the end of the video. So as well as showing you how to put everything together, I'm going to show you how to install Windows 10, any programs and drivers we're going to need to get our PC up and running, including any RGB software, and I'll give you a demonstration of how it works. I'll show you how to enter the BIOS. If our motherboard needs a BIOS update, I'll show you how to do that. I'll show you how to overclock the RAM, adjust the fan curves, and then at the end of the video, we'll run some benchmarks to give you an idea of the performance you can expect from this PC. So if you've never built a PC before, you've definitely come to the right place. So just before I go through all the parts I've chosen for today's build, I wanted to let you know about a giveaway that Team Group is currently running. So Team Group is currently running a giveaway called Be Creative and Win with T-Create. So you can go ahead and join the February event for your chance to win your own T-Create RAM for free. So you'll find a link to their event in the description, so go ahead and click and win. For the case, I've gone for Fractal Design's brand new Meshify 2 Compact. And this is their direct successor to their very popular Meshify C. It contains a whole host of modern features brought over from their larger Meshify 2, which I was very impressed with when I reviewed. So I'm really looking forward to doing a build in this case, and a big thanks to Fractal for sending it out. For the motherboard, I've got the brand new ROG Strix Z590F Gaming Wi-Fi motherboard. So although we're still waiting for Intel's Rocket Lake CPUs to be released, we can actually go ahead and use this motherboard with 10th gen CPUs. And a big thanks to Intel for sending out their i9-10850K for today's build. So this CPU has 10 cores and 20 threads with a base clock of 3.6 GHz and a boost clock all the way up to 5.2 GHz. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how this performs in the benchmarks, particularly compared to the Ryzen systems that I've built in the past. Keeping our CPU cool, I've gone with a 240mm AIO from Fractal. It's their Celsius Plus S24 Prisma. So this AIO is quite interesting. It actually has a hub on the radiator that you go ahead and plug the fans into, and all connections to the motherboard are made from the pump itself. So I'm really looking forward to testing it out. For RAM, I've got 32GB of Kingston's HyperX Fury RGB at 3600 MHz speed. So this RAM not only looks great, but it also performs well. And a big thanks to Kingston for sending it out for today's build. For storage, Sabrent to hook me up with one of their brand new Rocket 4 Plus PCIe Gen 4 NVMe M.2 SSDs. So this model has a new controller, which means it can run even faster than the previous version, with write speeds up to 7,100 megabytes per second and read speeds of up to 6,600 megabytes per second. So unfortunately we're not going to be able to see those speeds in today's build, and the reason for that is until the Rocket Lake CPUs arrive, this motherboard is going to be limited to Gen 3 speeds. The reason I've decided to include this drive is that if I was building a PC for myself using this motherboard, this is the drive I would use. So when the new CPUs arrive, all you would need to do is drop the CPU into the motherboard and the full potential of the drive would be unlocked without having to change any other hardware. So the drive Sabrent have sent out is a 2TB drive, which should offer plenty of storage. I do have one of their 1TB Gen 3 drives, which I'm going to include, just because I'm interested in comparing the speed of them both on a Gen 3 motherboard. As well as this, I've got a SATA drive. It's a 500GB drive from Kingston, their KC600, and the main reason for including it is just to show you how to install a SATA drive in this case. So again, a big thanks to Sabrent and Kingston for sending out drives for today's build. For the graphics card, I've decided to go with the ROG Strix RTX 3080. I've used this graphics card in a number of builds so far and been really impressed with it, and I'm really keen to see how this performs in an Intel system compared to the AMD ones that I've built in the past. Powering the whole build, I've got an 850 watt fully modular power supply from Corsair. It's their RM850. For case fans, this case comes with 3 fans pre-installed, 2 at the front and 1 at the rear. I'm planning on putting the AIO at the top, so I don't think there's any need to pick up any additional fans for today's build. The final part for today's build is some black and white cable extensions from CableMod. It is important to note that our RTX 3080 will require 3 8-pin connectors. This cable set will only come with two 8-pin cables, so you will need to either pick up 2 packs of cable extensions or an additional 8-pin cable. Okay, so that's all the parts. Let's get on with the build. The first thing I like to do in any build is to prepare the case. By that I mean removing any panels, dust filters or anything else that's going to get in our way during the build. This case has a lot of really cool features, so I'll point them out as we go along. The tempered glass side panel is held on with a little catch at the back. All we need to do is pull it forward and then we can lift the panel away. It's exactly the same process with the rear side panel. We just need to pull the catch at the back and then we can lift the panel away. The front mesh panel can be opened by pulling the Fractal logo out. So the right side is actually on hinges, and to remove the panel from the hinges all we need to do is pull it forward. If we look at the back of the panel, you'll notice as well as a layer of mesh, you've also got a nylon dust filter which can be removed by pulling it upwards. So this is one of the nice things Fractal Design are doing. They're giving you the choice. So if you want a more airflow focused case, you can run just with the mesh on the front. If keeping your case free from dust is more important, you can run with both the mesh and the dust filter. To remove the rest of the front panel, all we need to do is pull forward at the bottom and it can simply be removed. The top panel can simply be removed by pushing up at the front and then lifting it off. As you can see, we've got a layer of metallic mesh here. Below the mesh top panel, we've got a dust filter which can be removed by pulling things backwards and lifting away. And again, you've got the choice on the top. You can run just with the mesh panel or the mesh plus the dust filter. On the top of the case, we've got a removable fan stroke radiator bracket. It's held on with 2 screws at the front. With the screws removed, we can simply lift the bracket away. One of the nice things about this bracket is you can actually go ahead and install your radiator or your fans on the bracket outside the case and then bring it along and put it in the top, which is going to be much easier than having to install the radiator with the top panel on. The other nice thing with this bracket off, you've got great access to the top of the case during the build. In the main compartment of the case, we've got a 2-part cover which covers this cutout, which will let you actually install radiators and fans all the way down to the bottom of the case. So to remove it, all we need to do is lift it upwards. So as I've mentioned, this cover comes in 2 parts. So for example, if you just want to install an extra fan down at the bottom, you go ahead and put the bigger part of the bracket on. If you obviously want to install really thick radiators and fans, you can actually leave both sides off. Obviously to do that, you're going to need to remove the hard drive cage or slide the hard drive cage further along to the left-hand side of the case. So the big advantage of having this cover is that any cables down at the bottom are going to be hidden from sight. Having a quick look at the main compartment of the case, we've got 2 140mm fans pre-installed at the front and a 120mm fan installed at the rear. At the rear of the case, we can see we've got 7 horizontal PCIe expansion slot covers. We've also got a bracket for our power supply. It's held on with 2 thumb screws. Once these are loosened, the bracket can simply be removed. You're going to go ahead and attach this to your power supply, and then one of the nice things is you can actually slide your power supply straight in from the back. If you don't have this bracket, you have to slide the power supply in from the side, and it's a little bit more difficult. Down at the bottom of the case, we've got a full-length tray-style dust filter, which can simply be pulled out from the front. At the rear of the case, we can see we've got plenty of Velcro straps for cable management, and over to the left-hand side, we've actually got tracks for the cables to run in. As well as the Velcro straps, we've got plenty of cable tie points for managing cables. All the cutouts appear to be in the right place, and it's nice to see there's rubber grommets on the cutouts. The case comes with 2 dedicated 2.5-inch drive brackets. These can be removed by loosening the thumb screw at the top and lifting upwards. If you prefer, you can of course mount your 2.5-inch drives on top of the power supply shroud using the same brackets from the back. Down in the bottom left-hand side of the case, we've got a hard drive cage, and this is where we find our case accessory box. So I'll show you what this contains later in the video. The hard drive cage has 2 drive trays where you can mount both 2.5-inch or 3.5-inch drives. To remove the drive tray, you just need to loosen the thumb screws on the right-hand side, and then the drive tray can be removed. The hard drive cage at the bottom of the case can be moved to the right and to the left. To move it, the first thing you need to do is loosen the screws on the bottom of the case. Okay, so the hard drive cage is held at the bottom of the case with 4 screws, which I'm going to go ahead and loosen. With the screws loosened, we can now move the hard drive cage to where we want it to be at the bottom, and then we would simply secure it in place by tightening the 4 screws at the bottom. Alternatively, we can go ahead and remove the hard drive cage by removing the 4 screws. With the 4 screws removed, we can simply remove the hard drive cage through the main compartment of the case. So as I'm not planning on using any hard drives in the build, I'm going to go ahead and leave the hard drive cage removed. We're going to install our 2.5-inch SSD into one of these dedicated brackets. And you can see the reason why you might want to remove the hard drive cage. We've now got much more space at the bottom for the cables from our power supply. And these are going to be hidden because we've got the little covers for the cutout at the top, which is going to hide the cables fully. The other reason you may want to remove the power supply is you can actually mount a 120mm fan on the bottom of the case set to an intake. And hopefully this then will bring more air to your GPU. I'm not going to do this in this build guide, but when I do my thermal testing video, I will test the effects of adding an intake fan down at the bottom. In the case box, you'll find your user guide. In the hard drive cage, you'll find your accessory box. I'll go ahead and show you what this contains. So this is what's contained in the accessory box. One of the nice things that Fractal does is they've individually wrapped each of the screws so you're not going to mix them up. I'll go ahead and take the screws I'm going to use in this build out of the packaging. Okay, so the first lot of screws look fairly similar. They're a similar size of screw. One of them has a little lip around the outside, whereas the second one has a fully rounded head. This one with the fully rounded head is for securing the motherboard to the back of the case. This one with a little lip around the outside is for securing 2.5-inch drives. We've got some rubber dampeners for mounting hard drives. We've got an additional standoff, which we're not going to need to use, so I'm going to leave that in the plastic wrapping. And we've got a tool for removing the standoff and then securing it into a new place. We've got some screws for mounting 3.5-inch drives. We've obviously removed our hard drive cage, so we're not going to use that. And then we've got these slightly larger screws, which are for securing our power supply. We've got some cable ties for cable management, and then we've got a little cloth for cleaning the case. This is our motherboard, and we're going to do as much work with the motherboard while we have it on the table, because it's much easier to work on a flat table than it is in the cramped confines of the case. So we're going to go ahead and install our CPU in the socket, which is hidden behind this protective cover at the moment. We're going to install our M.2 SSDs, and this motherboard has 4. There's one here, and 2 here behind the heat sinks. And we're going to install our RAM into these 4 sockets here. And then we're going to go ahead and put the backplate on for our CPU cooler, all before we put the motherboard into the case. This is our CPU, and what you'll notice is I'm holding it by the edges, and the reason for that is I don't want to get anything on the gold contacts on the bottom of the CPU and potentially stop it from working. The other important thing to point out about the CPU, if you look maybe about 3/4 of the way down on both the right and left side, there's a little semicircle. And this is going to help you orientate the CPU in the socket, and it's going to mean the CPU can actually only go in the socket one way round. So our CPU socket is hidden behind this protective cover, and this protective cover prevents the pins on the socket from being damaged when it's not got a CPU installed in it. So we're going to need to go ahead and open this up, and by pushing this lever down and bringing it outwards, we can then go ahead and lift things up and then lift this upwards. And then you can see the little pins on the socket that we don't want to damage. So if we look closely at the socket, you can see there's little bits of plastic, again about 3/4 of the way down on both the right and left hand side, and that's going to help us orientate the CPU in the socket. The other thing to point out, if you look at the motherboard itself, there's a little white circle down at the bottom left hand corner, and that will line up with the gold triangle on the CPU itself. Okay, so to install our CPU, all we need to do is line the notches up with the marks on the socket and let the CPU fall into place. Then all we need to do is close this cover over, and then we can bring this lever back down again and slide the clip in under here. And in doing that, this protective cover will have popped off, and all we need to do is lift it away. Now it is important we don't throw this out. We should put this into our motherboard box, so if we ever remove our CPU, we can insert it back on and prevent the pins from being damaged. So this motherboard actually has 4 M.2 SSD sockets. There's one behind this heatsink, one behind this heatsink, and actually we've got 2 behind this long heatsink. Now only the top 2 sockets will support Gen 4 speeds, while the 2 bottom sockets will support up to Gen 3 speeds. The other important thing to note is the top 2 sockets go directly to the CPU, while the two bottom sockets go via the chipset. Another important thing to note is this top socket will only work with a new 11th gen Rocket Lake CPU. So with our 10850K installed, this socket is currently deactivated. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the heatsinks from the middle and bottom two sockets. So this is our M.2 SSD. You'll notice the gold connectors over to the right hand side, which are going to plug into the motherboard. The gold semicircle over to the left hand side is where we're going to secure it to the motherboard. So this is our M.2 SSD socket, and to install the drive, all we want to do is insert it at a slight angle into the socket. Once we're happy the drive's installed, we can just apply a little bit of pressure to flatten it down. And one of the great things about this motherboard, and this is the first time I've seen this, normally you would have to use screws and they can be quite fiddly to put in. What Asus have done with this board is they've got a clip installed that's going to hold the drive in place. All we need to do is push this over to the side and the little bit of plastic is going to hold our drive perfectly in place. Okay, same thing with our Gen 3 drive. I'm going ahead and insert it into the socket at a slight angle. Once I'm happy I'm in, I'm going to flatten it down and then I'm going to use this little clip to close things in place. So you can see we've got an extra slot in behind this socket, and this is our second slot, so the M.2 SSD would go in this way over here. So we'll go ahead and put the heat sinks back on. So just before we go ahead and put the heatsink back on, we just need to remove the plastic protection from the back of it. Okay, we can go ahead and line the heatsink back up again. Okay, we'll go ahead and remove the plastic protection from this longer heatsink. So what you might be seeing is the only downside of these little plastic clips. We've got damage here, and this one had damage in the similar place, and obviously this is a brand new out of the box. This is our RAM, and what's important to note is we've got two gold connectors down the bottom. The one over to the right hand side is longer than the one to the left hand side, so it's important we line the RAM up in the socket the right way round. To prepare our motherboard to receive the RAM, we just need to open these clips on the top of the sockets. Next, we just need to go ahead and line the RAM up in the socket. Once we're happy things are lined up the right way, we just need to apply some firm pressure to the top and the RAM will lock into place and the clip will close. And then it's just the same process with the other sticks of RAM. The next thing for us to do is to go and install the backplate for our AIO, and you're going to find this in the box with the AIO. So all I need to do is lift the motherboard up, slide this in from the back. Then we're going to get these little standoffs in the AIO box, and all we're going to do is screw these in to the backplate. Okay, we're now ready to go ahead and get our motherboard into the case. Just before we do, I want to point out a couple of important features. You can see we have got 9 standoffs at the back of the case in 3 rows of 3, and this is where we're going to use to secure our motherboard with the screws in the accessory box. The one thing to note is the middle standoff is slightly different. There's no hole in it, and it is designed to go through the centre of the motherboard and hold the motherboard in place, helping you to get the rest of the screws into place. The other thing, I've got an RTX motherboard. If you've got a different size motherboard, you might need to remove some of the standoffs and put them into a different position. We've got a little code here at the back of the case. I've checked and all our standoffs are in the right place, so we can go ahead and put our motherboard into the case. Just before we do, if your motherboard doesn't have an integrated I/O shield, you should go ahead and insert your I/O shield before you put your motherboard in. The final thing to mention is I install my motherboard with the case upright, because that gives you guys a better view of things. You will find it much easier though if you put the case down on its back to install the motherboard. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and insert the motherboard into the case at the back and try and get that middle standoff lined up with the case. So that's the middle standoff in place, and you can see actually the motherboard standing pretty well. Now all I need to do is put the 8 screws in. The next thing I like to get plugged in any build is our case cables. And our case cables come from the front I/O and let the ports on the top of the case work. So we've got a headphone and microphone jack on the front, and we need to plug our HD audio into the motherboard to allow it to work. We've got 2 USB Type A ports on the top of the case, and we need to plug this USB 3.0 cable into our motherboard to allow them to work. One of the nice features of our case is it's got a front USB Type-C port, but we need to plug this cable into our motherboard to let it work. Then we've got our tricky front panel connectors. They will control a variety of things. The reason I say they're tricky is all these need to go into the one header on specific pins on that header. So we've got a power LED which lights up on the front of the case to let us know it's got power. We've got our power switch and we've got a reset switch. So obviously we're going to need to plug these into the motherboards to allow the buttons on the top of the case to work. As well, our case has 3 case fans already installed, so we're going to need to plug these into the motherboard to allow them to work. So we'll go ahead and get the case cables plugged in. Okay, first cable for us to plug in is our HD audio cable. It's going to go into this header over the far left hand side of the motherboard. So I'm just going to bring it through the closest cutout. What you'll notice, if you look at the header, there's a pin missing in the top row. There's also a hole missing in the cable itself. So we need to line it up the right way, and that is with the HD audio text facing upright. So we'll go ahead and line that up with the socket, and then pull the excess cable out the back. Next thing for us to plug in is our tricky front panel connectors, and they're going to go into this header. This header is actually 2 headers. The one we're interested in is the one over to the left hand side. Now it's really important you refer to the diagram in the motherboard manual so you plug these in to the right pins on the header. What I would recommend doing is starting with the bottom row and working your way upwards. If you start at the top row, you'll not be able to see the bottom pins beneath it to plug the cables in. It looks like I've done it the opposite way in the close-ups in the video, but that's just so you can see every cable being plugged into every pin. So the first cable for us to plug in is our reset switch. It's going to go into the bottom row into pins 3 and 4 from the left hand side, and I'm going to plug it in with the text facing down the way. Okay, moving up to the top row, starting from left to right, pins 1 and 2 are for power LED positive and power LED negative. Next to that, we've got our power switch into pins 3 and 4 from the left hand side in the top row. Okay, next cable to plug in is our USB 3.0 cable. Importantly, if you look at the socket, there's a little notch on one side. Our cable also has a notch, so it'll help us line things up the right way round. You need to be really careful when plugging this cable in. This is the easiest one to bend the pins in the motherboard, and if you bend the pins, then your front I/O is not going to work. So be careful plugging it in. If it doesn't go, stop and realign things rather than using any force. So we'll bring things through the cutout, line up the notches on the cable with the notch on the socket. And once we're happy things are lined up, we'll apply a little bit of pressure and things will push into place. And then we'll just bring the excess cable out the back. The header just above it is for our Type-C cable. So again, I'm going to bring it through the same cutout, line things up with the header, and once we're happy things are lined up, push it into place. And then again, pull the excess cable out the back. Just below these headers, we've got our 6 SATA ports. We are going to need 1 SATA data cable plugged in for our SATA drive. So I'm going to go ahead and plug this in now. So I'm going to bring the cable through the cutout below. It doesn't matter which of the ports we plug it into, but there is an L shape on the port and an L shape on the cable, so we just want to line things up the right way. Okay, next thing I want to do is to go ahead and plug our fans in. So this motherboard has 3 case fan headers and we have got 3 case fans. So we've got 1 here and there's also 2 down the bottom of the motherboard. So I'm going to go ahead and plug this rear fan into this fan header here. Importantly now, our fan header has 4 pins, but the cables in our fans only have 3 pins. And that's not a big problem. There's notches on the cable and notches on the header, so they're only going to go into the right 3 pins. What is important, however, is that we run our case fans in DC mode. And don't worry about that, I'll show you how to do that later when we enter the BIOS. If we leave our motherboard fan curve set to PWM mode, these fans will run at 100% all of the time, so it's really important that we change that. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and line things up with the header and push things into place. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use one of the cable ties from the accessory box to shorten this cable and make things look a little bit tidier. And then I'm just going to go ahead and tuck that in behind the fan. So now to get our front fans plugged in, and what you'll notice is the cable from the top fan, when it comes from the factory, goes out this port at the top and then down the back of the motherboard. The one from the bottom is routed down the bottom into the bottom of the case here. Now the problem with the top one going up it's not going to be long enough to reach the port down the bottom of the motherboard. So all I have done is brought it back through this top cutout and pushed it in down the bottom of the two fans. So we're now left with two cables to plug in down the bottom of the motherboard, and they'll both be long enough to reach. Okay, so I'm going to bring our shorter top fan through this rubber cutout at the bottom and plug it into our fan header here. And then we'll pull the excess cable down to the bottom of the case. I'm going to go ahead and bring our other cable out alongside our HD audio cable. And then we've got a fan header just here to plug into. At this stage I'm just going to replace the brackets covering this slot. So we'll line them up at the back. Once we're happy, push it into place. And then we'll take the shorter cover. Again, line things up at the back. Once we're happy, just push down at the front and that will clip into place. This is our power supply, and it's what you call a fully modular power supply because none of our cables are plugged in. The big advantage to this is you only need to plug the cables in that you're going to use, which makes cable management that little bit easier. The downside is it tends to be more expensive. Okay, so we'll make a start of getting our cables plugged in. We're going to need a 24-pin cable, which is going to go in here over the top right-hand side. It's got two different connectors, and then the other end is going to go into our motherboard. So on the top left-hand side of our motherboard, we've got an 8-pin connector and a 4-pin connector, providing additional power to our CPU. So we're going to need to plug two of these cables in. So I'm just going to go ahead down to the bottom row and start plugging these in. So another important thing to note is one end of the cables will have CPU written on it, so that's the end that's to go into the motherboard rather than into the power supply. So at the moment we've got two 8-pin connectors plugged in. That's not a problem because these will split apart and you've got a 4-pin and an 8-pin, which is what we need for our motherboard. Next cable for us to plug in is a PCIe cable, and again I'm just going to go ahead and plug it into the next slot along in the bottom. So looking at the other end of the cable, we've got a 6-pin plus a 2-pin connector and a 6-pin plus a 2-pin connector, so that's going to give us two 8-pin connectors. Now importantly, our graphics card is going to need three 8-pin connectors, so I'm going to need to go ahead and plug another cable in. Okay, so we'll just go to the next socket along. So what I have heard other people say is that if you've got a high-powered graphics card, you're better to use separate cables coming from the power supply rather than using these daisy-chained connectors. I don't know if that's true myself, but because we do have an extra socket on our power supply that will take a PCIe cable and we have another cable in the box, I'm just going to go ahead and plug in the third PCIe cable, and then we'll just use one 8-pin connector on each of the cables rather than using this daisy chain. So we'll go ahead and plug it in here. It is important to say I have ran this graphics card using the daisy chain method before and I haven't noticed any problems. So if you don't have enough headers in your power supply, I don't think it's going to be a big problem. Then our last cable to plug in is a SATA cable, and that's going to provide power to our SSD. And I'll just plug it into the next header along on the top. So if you're not planning on using the cable extensions, your power supply is ready to go. I am, so I'm going to go ahead and plug the cable extensions in. So we've got our 24-pin cable, and then we've got this black and white cable extension. So I'm just going to line them up. There's a little notch on the extension, and we've got a notch on the cable. Line them up and push them into place. Now how these extensions work is the black and white bit of the cable is then going to be on display on the front of the case, whereas the black bit of the cable is going to be hidden at the back. The only downside to this is you've significantly increased the amount of cables at the bottom of the case, so cable management might be a little bit more difficult. Okay, so we'll go ahead and plug in the cables for the CPU. And you see here this cable extension for the CPU splits into two 4-pin connectors. Okay, next is the cable for our graphics card. So I've lined up our 6 and our 2-pin cable and we'll plug the extension in. Okay, same again. Next we can go ahead and line the case bracket up with the back of the power supply and secure things into place using the screws we got in our accessory box. Okay, we can now go ahead and get the power supply into the case. Okay, first thing to do is to pull all the cables through. Just before we put the power supply into the case, it's important to point out this is the power supply's intake fan, and we're going to want to install this with the intake fan facing the bottom of the case. Remember, we had the dust filter along the bottom of the case, and the bottom of the case is perforated, so this is going to give our power supply a source of cold air. So we can go ahead and insert the power supply into the back of the case. And then we can go ahead and secure things into place using the thumb screws at the back. Next we can go ahead and plug the cables in, providing additional power to the CPU, and it's these two headers here just at the top left hand side of the motherboard. We've got a cutout just above it, so I'm going to go ahead and bring the cables through. Then we just need to line things up and we'll push the cable into place. We've got little cable combs on the cables, so I can pull these out a little bit and that will just tidy the cable up, and then we'll pull the excess cable out the back. So I'm going to go ahead and bring our 4-pin cable through as well. And again, we'll go ahead and line that up with the socket, push things into place, and then again, pull the excess cable out the back and tidy things up with the cable combs. Next cable to plug in is our 24-pin connector, and it's going to go to this header here. So I'm just going to bring it through this cutout. Again, this cable has a little clip on it and there's a little notch on the right hand side of the header. So it's just important to line those up in the right way round. Once we're happy things are lined up, we can go ahead and push things into place. Again, this cable has some cable combs which will help us tidy up the cable. And then we can just bring the excess cable out the back. Next we can go ahead and install our SATA SSD onto its bracket. So importantly, we are going to want these little connectors to be at the bottom of it, whereas this screw is at the top. So it's going to need to go on this way round. So we'll go ahead and turn things over, and then we'll go ahead and get things screwed into place. Just before I go ahead and install this in the case, it's easier to point out the connectors to you now while it's on the table. The shorter connector over to the left hand side is for SATA data. The longer connector over to the right hand side is for SATA power. So the cable we plugged into our motherboard is going to go to this connector on the left hand side, and the cable coming from our power supply is going to go over to the right hand side. Okay, so we can go ahead and put the drive onto the case. We just need to line things up and then tighten things up with the thumb screw. Next we can go ahead and plug our cables in. So the SATA data cable is going to go over to the right hand side, and then our SATA power cable over to the left hand side. Okay, next we're going to start work on our AIO, and the first thing for us to do is to get the fans on the AIO. So I'm going to install the fans with the front of the fan facing into the case, so it's going to be an exhaust at the top of the case, blowing air from inside the case outwards. So in this orientation, it's on the right way round. The next thing for us to decide is which end should the cables come out, and we're going to want them coming out the back of the case so they can't be seen. So I've already lined things up in the case, and I think the tubes over to the right hand side is going to look best. So in this current orientation, this is going to be the back of the case, so the fans are in the right orientation here. So we can go ahead and put the second fan onto the radiator, and then using the long screws that come with the AIO, we'll go ahead and get the fans secured to the radiator. Okay, next we need to look at the connectors coming from each of the fans. So we've got a standard 4-pin fan connector, and on the other cable we've got a 5-volt 3-pin addressable RGB connector. Now this connector splits into two, and this is going to give us the option to daisy chain things together. So this AIO is fairly unique in that we're going to plug all the cables coming from the fans into a hub on our radiator. Okay, so I'm going to make a start with the 4-pin fan connectors, just going to bring the cable through and then plug it in to the connector. Okay, so I've got the other 4-pin fan connector, and again that's it plugged in to the hub. Just behind these fans we've got a 3-pin 5-volt addressable RGB connector, so I'm going to go ahead and plug the cable coming from one of the fans into this header. Okay, so we'll go ahead and line things up and then push things into place. I'm just going to pull the excess cable over to the side here. So what I'm going to do now, the other end of the RGB cable that we've plugged into the hub, I'm going to go ahead and remove the protection. Then I'm going to take the cable coming from the other fan, line up the two arrows on it and push things into place. So we're going to daisy chain the second fan onto the first fan that we've already plugged in. And obviously if we had a radiator that had 3 fans, we have another connector where we could daisy chain our third fan in. Now all we need to do is tidy up these cables so they're attached to the back of the radiator and out of the way. So in the AIO box you've got these 2 little clips which you can use with double-sided tape sticking to the back of the radiator to hold the cables in place. I may use this radiator in another build and I may have it turned the opposite way round, so I think I'm just going to use cable ties to tidy the cables up at the back. Next we can go ahead and secure this to the bracket we removed from the case earlier on. And we've got some short screws and washers that came with the AIO. So just before I go ahead and put this bracket into the top of the case, one of the things I'm noticing is that these black and white cable extensions, we're actually not going to be able to see any of them at all with this in place at the top. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and remove the cable extensions providing additional power to the CPU and just use the black cables coming from the power supply. The reason for this is, although we're not going to see them, we're going to have more cables at the back to manage, making cable management that little bit more difficult. So cable management will be easier if we remove these and we can't see them anyway. So before we go ahead and put our bracket on at the top, there's 2 cables we're going to want to plug in. One of them is coming from the pump head and it's going to go into our CPU fan header. The other cable we are going to need to plug into our pump head and it's going to go into a 5V addressable RGB header. So I'm going to make a start with it. So the cable's not currently plugged into the pump and I'm going to leave it that way for now. But the problem is once the radiator's up here, access to this header isn't going to be so good. So I'm going to go ahead and line things up with the header. The next cable that I want to plug in is our CPU fan header and it's just going to go into this header at the top of the motherboard. And then I'm going to set that down into the case for now. Next we can go ahead and put the bracket on at the top. We just need to line things up here and then lower things down. Next we can go ahead and screw things into place using the screws we removed at the start. Next we can go ahead and remove the protective covering from the pump. What you'll notice is we've got thermal paste pre-applied to the pump head. So all we need to do now is lower things down over the standoffs that we put in earlier on. And once we're happy things are over the standoffs, we can secure things into place with some thumb screws that come with the AIO. And then we can go ahead and tighten things up with a screwdriver. So I'm just going to start at one corner, give each a few turns before moving on to another corner. Okay, that's everything fully tightened. Okay, so I'm just going to bring this cable for the RGB down past the tubes and then plug it in down the bottom. Okay, there we go. Then all I'm going to do is push the excess cable up to the top. Okay, we've got a little bit of plastic protection over the pump head which we can go ahead and remove. We're now ready to go ahead and install our graphics card, so I'm going to remove the second and third slot cover from the top. And then we should be able just to slide these covers backwards and out of the way. To prepare the motherboard to receive our graphics card, all we need to do is push this little clip backwards. Then we just need to go ahead and line our graphics card up with the slot. Once we're happy things are lined up, we just need to apply some pressure. And you'll hear the clip close as the graphic card slots into place. Next we can go ahead and secure the graphics card into place using the screws we've just removed. Next we just need to go ahead and bring the cables to power our graphics card through the cutout at the bottom. And then we go ahead and plug things into the graphics card. And then we've got some cable combs on the cable which will help organise the cables. The final thing for us to do is to try and tidy up these mess of cables so we can go ahead and get the back panel back on. As you can see, we've got Velcro straps, and hopefully this should make things a little bit easier. We've also got additional cable tie points if we need them. And because we've removed our hard drive cage, we've got plenty of space down the bottom for cables as well. Okay, we can go ahead and replace our panels. Okay, so that's the build complete. We've now reached the really important stage in any PC build where we need to go ahead and flip the power switch and see do we get a boot screen. Importantly, I have loaded a Windows 10 bootable USB drive into the back of the PC. If you don't know how to make one of those, you'll find a link to a video I've made in the description. Okay, moment of truth, here goes. Okay, so that's good signs. We've got lights, we've got fans spinning. So we're just going to need to keep an eye on the monitor and see what happens. So that's good. The ASUS logo has appeared and it looks like it's found our devices. Now let's have a look. It's got our CPU, it's picked up our memory, and it's picked up some of our drives. So we're getting a message down the bottom saying it's detected a device in the M.2 socket number 2, and we're going to have to enter the BIOS to configure it to allow us to use it. So that is where we're going to want to install our operating system onto, so I'm going to go ahead and press F1 to run the BIOS. Okay, so I'm going to head over to Advanced, and we're going to head down to, as I said, Onboard Devices Configuration, and we'll work our way down. So it must be the CPU PCIe configuration mode that we're going to have to go into. Let's see, it's currently set to Auto. Okay, so looking at the options available, we're going to have to enable our second M.2 SSD socket, so I'm going to go ahead and click it here. Then we can go ahead and click on Exit, and we're going to save changes and reset. It's going to give us a summary of what we've changed, and we're going to go ahead and click on OK. Now hopefully that we've enabled that socket, it's going to go ahead and find our Windows 10 bootable USB drive in the back of the PC and boot off that. So we've got the ASUS logo this time. If that's going to happen, the next thing we should see is the Windows logo appearing. So that's great. We're through to the Windows installer screen, so I'll go ahead and show you how to install Windows 10. So as you go through the installation process, I'm going to pick the options that are relevant to me. Obviously, if you have different options, you should pick the ones that are relevant to you. So I'm from the United Kingdom, I'm going to click Next. I'm going to go ahead and click Install Now. Okay, if you've got a Windows 10 product key, you can go ahead and enter it in the box here. If you don't have one, go ahead and click on I don't have a product key. What you can then do is select the version of Windows you're going to get a product key for. So I'm going to go ahead and select Windows 10 Pro and click Next. So you'll have access to most of Windows features without entering a license key. There will be some limitations, but you will be able to go ahead and install it. So I'm going to go ahead and click Accept the license, click Next, and then we're going to go for a custom install. Okay, so what we can see, we've got our 3 drives showing up. So we've got our SATA SSD, which is 500 gigabytes. We've got our Gen 4 M.2 SSD from Sabrent, and then we've got our Gen 3 drive from Sabrent. If you have a number of drives installed and they have the same amount of space on them, people often ask how can you tell them apart. What I have found is your SATA drives tend to show up first, then your M.2 SSDs, and they tend to show up in the order that the M.2 SSD sockets are labelled, so 1, 2, 3, 4. For us, it's no problem for us to work out which is which. I want to install it on our 2 terabyte drive, so I'm going to go ahead and select it and click Next. This step will take a little bit of time, so I'll go ahead and speed things up for you. And then as we're going through the install, I'll speed up between the steps. Okay, I'm from the United Kingdom. I'm going to click on Yes and Yes again. I'm going to skip the secondary keyboard. Okay, I do have actually an Ethernet cable plugged in. For some reason, it's not picking it up, so I'm going to go ahead and click I don't have internet and continue with limited setup. So I'm going to need to go ahead and put my name in here. Click Next. Create a password, then I'm going to need to set up 3 security questions. So I'm going to select Don't use online speech recognition. I'm going to let apps use my location. yes to find my device. I'm just going to send the required data. No jinking, no again, no again. I'm going to click not now. Okay, so it says the motherboard comes preloaded with a LAN driver, so I'm going to go ahead and click yes. Okay, so we are going to need the Armoury Crate and Aura Creator, so I'm just going to go ahead and let this download. Okay, we just need to click on I agree and accept. So what I'll do, I'll come back later on to the Armoury Crate and show you how things work. So the first thing I like to do when I've got Windows installed is get it fully up to date before we go ahead and install any drivers. So to do that, we just need to click on the Windows icon, click on the Settings tab, click on the Updates and Security, and then it's going to go ahead and try and find updates for Windows. What Windows will do is it will find a number of different updates. It'll probably need to restart a number of times, but we're going to keep going ahead and looking for more updates, and then we're only going to move forward when there's no further updates available. Okay, that's Windows fully up to date. Whenever I click on check for updates, there's no more updates available. Okay, next thing I want to do is to get all our SSDs to show up, because if I go ahead and click on this PC, the chances are only one of our drives is showing up. So it's our 2TB drive, but we also have a second M.2 SSD and a SATA drive. So to get these to show up, what we need to do is type disk management into the bar at the bottom. And then we're going to go ahead and click on the create and format hard disk partition. It's going to ask us to initialize the disks. We're going to click on OK. And then what you can see, our two drives are now showing up as unallocated space. So there's our SATA SSD. And if we go down, there's our M.2 SSD. So I'm going to right click on this and click New Simple Volume. Click Next, Next. It's going to assign things the letter D. If I want to change that, I can do so from the pull down menu. Click Next, and then we can name the drive and click on Next and finish. Same thing with our SATA SSD, right click, New Simple Volume, Next, Next. It's assigned things the letter E, that's fine. And we're just going to name it, click Next and finish. Okay, if we go back to this PC, we can now see that all three of our drives are showing up. Okay, next thing I want to do is install the drivers we're going to need for our motherboard. So I normally get these from our motherboard's webpage over on ASUS's website. So I'm over on our motherboard's page, and what we can see, there's a version of the BIOS available. This is actually the same version of the BIOS that's installed in our motherboard, so I'm not going to be able to show you how to update the BIOS in this video. Although in plenty of other of my full build guides I have updated the BIOS, so you'll be able to find steps to do that in one of those other videos. There's actually only 2 of the chipset drivers available on the web page, and because this is a relatively new board, it's only been released a few days ago, ASUS don't seem to have updated their web page with the latest drivers. There is another place where we can get the drivers, and that's in the Armoury Crate, which we have already installed, so let's have a look over there. Okay, so we go ahead and open the Armoury Crate. And then if we go ahead and click on the Tools tab, it's going to go ahead and search for drivers. And I'm just going to click on Download and Install for all the drivers. Click Yes. So I'm going to click on Allow Access. Okay, so that's all the drivers installed. We just need to go ahead and restart our PC. Okay, so that's all our drivers updated to the latest version, and actually this is a really nice way to install the drivers at the start of a build, because you can just leave it running and go and get yourself a cup of tea rather than have to do everything individually. So it might be something I look at in the future. Just while we're in the Armoury Crate, I'm going to show you how to adjust the RGB. So we'll go ahead and click on the Aura Sync tool. And at the moment we can see everything is selected. So we've got our motherboard, our graphics card, our memory, and our addressable strip. And importantly, our CPU cooler is plugged into the addressable strip. So we'll click on Aura Effects. So if you have a look at the PC at the moment, you'll see everything is set to rainbow. We can change the pattern, or we can increase the speed. I'll go ahead and increase the speed. And you'll notice the rainbow effects are now cycling more quickly. We can slow everything down as well. I'll leave it in the middle. Or we can apply a different one of these effects. Let's have a look at color cycle. So in this particular case, I think having everything to set to white is going to look best. So I'm going to click on a static color. I'm going to change the color from red. So to get white, all I need to do is enter the code in here and click on OK. And what you'll now see is that everything in the PC has changed to white. Okay, if we didn't want to sync every device and we wanted to change the devices individually, we would just have to unselect them here, and then we could go into each device individually and set up different effects. Okay, next thing for us to do is to get the drivers for our graphics card, and we're going to get these from NVIDIA's website. We can of course get the individual drivers. I much prefer to install the GeForce Experience, so I'm going to go and show you how to do this by clicking Download Now. Okay, we can click on Open File, click Yes, we're going to agree and install. So if you have an NVIDIA account, you can go ahead and put your details in. If you don't have one, you can create one. I'll go ahead and put my details in. I'm going to skip the tour, and then if I go ahead and click on the Drivers tab, what we've got, we can choose the type of drivers that we want. So we've got Game Ready drivers selected, and if you use your PC mostly for gaming, go ahead and select this. If you use it mostly for content creation, you should select the studio drivers. I'm keen to test this PC's gaming performance, so I'm going to leave it with the Game Ready drivers, and then I'm going to go ahead and click on Download. Okay, I'm going to go for an express installation, click Yes, and then I am expecting the PC to flicker during the install as the drivers are being installed. That's just normal. Okay, so that's the drivers installed. We can click on Close. Okay, next thing I want to do is head over to the BIOS. So I'm going to click on the Windows icon, click on the power, and click on Restart. What we're going to do, just as the ASUS logo appears, we need to press the Delete key to enter the BIOS. It can be quite hard to time it, so what I normally do is start pressing Delete as soon as the black screen appears. So I'm going to go ahead and start pressing Delete now. There's the ASUS logo, so this should take us into the BIOS. Okay, so I think it's easier to see in the easy mode. I'll click on it. Okay, so the first thing for us to do is to get our RAM running at the correct speed. So you can see it's picked up our RAM, but it's currently running it at 2400 megahertz. Now our RAM can run at 3600 megahertz, so we're going to need to enable XMP. So we'll click here and click on Enabled. So you can see here it's found the XMP profile and our RAM is now running at 3600 megahertz. The next thing I want to do is have a look at our fans and check they're running just the way I want them to. So I'm going to click on QFan Control. Okay, so our CPU fan, what we have plugged into our CPU fan is our AIO, and both the pump and the fans are all running off the one connector. It's running off the standard fan curve. If we want to adjust the fan curve, we could change it to go into silent, go into turbo. We could run things at full speed, and you hear the noise ramp up in the background, or we could click on manual, and then we could drag these points to where we want them and make our own fan curve. I'm going to put things back to standard for now. I like to do all my initial testing with things set to standard. So up here we can change the mode. At the moment it's set to auto detect. We have plugged in a 4-pin connector, so we can run things in PWM mode. So I'm going to go ahead and enable PWM mode. So looking at our chassis fans is the next thing to do. So these fans again are running off the standard fan profile. They're set to auto detect. I'm going to set them to DC mode because that's what they need to run in. They've only got 3-pin connectors. I'm going to do the same with chassis fan number 2. And again, chassis fan number 3. And like I say, I'm going to leave things running in the standard fan curve because that's what I normally do the thermal testing, and then afterwards if I find the PC is particularly noisy I'll reduce things down. If I find I'm struggling with temperatures I might raise things up a little bit. So we don't have anything plugged into these other fan headers, so there's no need to look at them. So we can go ahead and click on Exit. And as we've already mentioned, we've got the latest version of the BIOS already installed. so there's no need for us to update things. Okay, to save the settings, we can either click F10 or click here. It's going to give us a summary of everything that has been changed. We just need to go ahead and click on OK. And then the PC will boot back into Windows. Okay, that's us back in Windows. First thing to do is check our RAM is running at the correct speed. So we right click here and click on Task Manager. We want to click on More Details, click on the Performance tab, and then click on the Memory. And what we can see, our RAM is running at 3600 MHz. Okay, so that's the build complete. I think the PC looks great and it's also running just as it should. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you some footage of the completed build, and then I'm going to run some benchmarks to give you an idea of the performance you can expect from the PC. Just before I do that, I just wanted to mention that you will find the full case review and thermal testing video in the description. If you've enjoyed the video, please remember to give it a thumbs up, and if you're not subscribed to the channel, please click that subscribe button. Okay, we'll run the footage of the completed build.